And again, he's clear about the fact that people often poached because they had to. In 1871, I was living by the side of a family where the father was out of work. This would be in Leicestershire, and the mother heartbroken. They had no hope and not much food. The husband was a good man, but a fool. When he drew his wages in times when work was plentiful, he would spend the surplus after paying his wife in drink. The poor children could not help, and thousands of men do the same. One Friday, after everything in the house had been pledged and there was not a hope of dinner for Sunday, I said to him, "Can't you poach?" "I would if I could," he said, "but I've nothing to poach with." "Come with me tomorrow," I said, "and I'll take you to Kettering Shoot. We'll kill 6 hares, and you can sell 3 for 12 shillings, and I will find you some food for a day or 2. His wife was afraid. The poor creature had no heart. She was beat. But I promised her he would run no risk. I won't read the rest of it, but basically his promise to the wife wasn't kept, because they did get caught and they did get chased, and the next few pages is a description of how they were chased by policemen. And there were a lot of chases going on. And in 1862, the Poaching Prevention Act was brought in, and that was primarily against night poaching, because night poaching was the main scourge. This was when the vast amount of game was taken. And the Poaching Prevention Act meant that keepers and other people, and it's laid down in the Act too, and it includes policemen, could stop people on roads and search them. And so after this, there was a great deal of, if you were running down a road and you had a rabbit, you would hide it in a ditch. I mean, you might well have hidden your game anyway. Or, and what Hawker does later in this is, he rushes into a private house, a poor person's private house, and they're sitting there having dinner, and he quickly tells the man what's happening. And so the man says to him, "Sit down at the table and make out your eating with me." And the bobby who's pursuing him comes knocking at the door, but he's in a private house, so he can't search him. So, I mean, this is an instance of how the vast majority, the huge majority of working class people supported poachers. Very rare, it did happen, it's very rare that they would give them up or assist the gamekeepers or the policemen when they were chasing them. So I suppose you might argue, well, all right, James Hawker is quite clear that he's protesting and that he's radical. Somebody might say, well, he was probably the only one who was. But it's not a very good argument, really. He happened to be able to write. And, you know, if he felt like this, the odds are that other people felt like this as well. Right, last of all, I thought I would just read you out some details from a phrase. So my main primary sources are parliamentary papers, in which there are the game returns and the judicial statistics, and also the minutes of a lot of the committees that sat to take evidence on the game laws. And through Ancestry, the family research site, I can get the criminal registers of all 3 counties online, which means I can see throughout the whole of the 19th century everybody that not just was convicted, but if they were acquitted as well, if they stood trial at a quarter sessions or an assize. And then my third major resource is local newspapers, which again are available online. And it just brings in so much information, more than you can process. So those are my main resources. So there was a famous affray in Scarcliffe Park in Derbyshire. It's only just over the border though. And this is from the Notts Guardian of the 28th of November 1850, and it's the assize court. Scarcliffe Park is just south-east of Bolsover. The keepers of Captain Wellfit of Langwith Lodge near Mansfield. He's a landowner. Captain Wellfit is a really funny name. Is quite a well-known sportsman. He lived to a great age, and I actually came across in some other primary source of a poem somebody had written celebrating Captain Wellfit's sporting exploits. And his hall was Langwith Lodge. There were 7 keepers armed, it doesn't say what with, and 15 poachers in this affray. The poachers were armed with guns, that's quite unusual, cudgels and other weapons. The leader of the poachers had a 2-edged sword, that's very unusual. One of the poachers was shot dead accidentally. That doesn't happen infrequently because the guns, even at this stage, were obviously not very reliable weapons, and they did seem to go off sometimes when they were in people's pockets. And the keeper Booth got a severe cut to the neck from the sword, which might prove fatal, but it didn't. All the poachers had white rags or ribbons round their arms. Occasionally they did that, and it really was a sure sign that they thought they might be in a fight and that they were willing to fight. So they had a white rag tied round their arms so that in the dark or the poor light they could make out which was their own side. And they had also blackened their faces, another sign that they were serious. Most of the time, I think, the gangs of night poachers were not looking for a fight. They were just looking to get as much as they could, and if keepers turned up, they'd run. They were reluctant to fight. They would only fight if they had to, particularly if the keepers had got hands on one of their own and they were trying to get him off. Thomas Booth with the gamekeepers was with 6 tenters or assistants, and the party had split into 2 groups, that is the keepers, and it was a small group which first engaged with the poachers. And Booth, the head keeper, said he had told the poachers that they, the keepers, would not attack them because they were outnumbered by the poachers. But the poachers attacked, he says. More poachers than originally seen came and joined in. This happens very frequently. Keepers take on what seems like a small number of poachers, and once they've started fighting, a lot more appear. Sometimes they summon them by shouting. Sometimes I think they may be another gang, acting independently, who just come to help. But sometimes they may be the same gang. The other half of the keepers arrived and helped, and the poachers then ran away. Meanwhile, a message had been sent for help, and Captain Welfit arrived with help and chafed after the poachers and got most of them. Captain Salmond, also a JP, caught the rest of them, possibly hours later or the next day. Palmer, one of the keepers, was praised for his cool bravery and intrepidity seldom surpassed. Sometimes the newspaper reports are quite sickening in the way that they praise, particularly gentlemen who have engaged in the poach. Keeper Booth was fending off an attack on himself when his gun accidentally went off and killed a poacher. Captain Welfit personally chased and dragged one of the poachers out of the drain where he was hiding. So it's fairly unusual, and that they obviously managed to apprehend some of the poachers at the scene. And when they apprehended at the scene, then the poachers couldn't pretend that they weren't there. A lot of the time, the poachers all got away. And what would then happen would be a message would be sent to the police at Mansfield or Newmarket or Nottingham or Loughborough or Leicester or wherever. There obviously were lots of poachers coming back into all these cities and towns in the early hours of the morning, and the police quite commonly saw them coming in. If there'd been a major affray, then word, and somebody had been hurt, then word would go out to the police, look out for anybody, and so the police would simply apprehend people that they found coming back into town in the early hours of the morning. Or they'd go to the houses of known poachers before they'd had time to get back, and if they weren't there, then they would go the next day and apprehend them and say, you weren't there, so it may have been you at this affray. And these people who were known poachers would then be paraded in front of the keepers and assistant keepers for them to ID. And a lot of the argument in court centred on whether or not the identification would satisfy the jury. And I think very often this is why, even in cases where there'd been an affray, they often only went to petty sessions, because then there would be no jury, it would just be the magistrates, and they would be more easily satisfied as to the identity of the poachers. Whereas a jury, particularly at quarter sessions, juries were quite ordinary people, would be very likely to say, well, I don't believe it was him. But when they'd actually been apprehended on the spot, they couldn't argue. So the poachers in custody, as reported on the 12th of December, were George Cutts of Bolsover, who decided to give voluntary evidence against the rest. He had a gun, and he got 2 years' hard labour, which was considerably less than he got. And from later information, I know that George Cutts was later helped by Captain Salmond. Captain Salmond very probably was the person, because Captain Salmond was a JP who'd persuaded him to turn Creed's evidence against the others. And Captain Salmond obviously felt badly about the fact that Cutts, having turned evidence, had got given 2 years' hard labour. And subsequently, Captain Salmond got Cutts out of prison and very generously gave him a job in one of his coal mines. And there is an article in a later bit of the newspaper saying how they hoped that George Cutts, having been so lucky to have been helped by Captain Salmond like this, is going to give up poaching now that he's got a good job as a miner and he doesn't need to poach. John Chapman is the one who had a sword. He was aged 31. He came from Bolsover. He was a labourer and he got transportation for life. William Worrell, 21, of Bolsover, was a brickmaker. I don't always know their sentences. Robert Grundy, of 21, Bolsover, a labourer, transportation for 10 years. William Clark, 22, had a gun, a labourer of Bolsover, transportation for 10 years. William Shepherd, 39, had a gun. He's of Heath. He was a blacksmith. He got transportation for 15 years. And so on it goes. Several more got transportation. Some just got hard labour. Imprisonment with hard labour was worse than just imprisonment. If you were just imprisoned, then you were just given something to do by way of work, I don't know, picking oakum or something. But if you were given hard labour, then it might be that you're actually being put in a treadmill and made to just go walk round and round for no purpose. To be given hard labour was very much worse. Mr. Kersham of Mansfield was permitted by the courtesy of the bench to watch the proceedings. So we're back to a report about when they were appearing just before magistrates, before they got sent to assizes. And so obviously these poachers can afford to employ a lawyer. And I need to look into what the cost of that would have been. But it seems to me that when poachers are employing a lawyer, it must be a sign that they're into poaching on a pretty big scale, or they wouldn't have the money to employ the lawyer. Unless they have got an entrenched involvement with the black market and somebody else is paying for a lawyer for them. But most of the time, a majority of the time, poachers appearing for more than day poaching have got a lawyer representing them from fairly early in the century. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes when you would have thought, somebody comes up and it says they've got a string of convictions and you think, well, they must have been poaching on a grand scale, but still they haven't got a lawyer. William Picker, superintendent of police, overheard some of the prisoners talking as they were being transported to Mansfield. Prisoner Goodlad said that he wouldn't have gone poaching if he had a job. Evans said he wouldn't have gone if his father had given him any pocket money. Shepherd the younger said he ran away when the fight began because his father told him to. There's quite a bit of evidence of the poachers being quite protective towards the very young ones involved. Quite often somebody who turns Queen's evidence will be perhaps just 15, and I suspect that the poachers perhaps may accept amongst themselves that he will turn Queen's evidence without necessarily having a vendetta against him because he's so young. And then there's this lad who ran away because his father told him to. John Johnson of Bolsover, blacksmith, had charge of 5 of the poachers on the morning after the event. It sounds as if they'd rounded up some poachers and locked them up in a room that perhaps was available in the local smithy. And he says that William Shepherd, one of the poachers, said to him, "John, what I done tonight has all been done for want. My family have not a bit to eat in the house." So these were being indicted for maliciously and feloniously cutting and wounding, with intent to murder for some of them, and for some of them with intent to disable, and for some of them with intent to do GBH. And this is something that I learned after I'd started, that when I started scanning through the criminal registers online, looking out for people who were up for poaching, I wasn't getting all the poachers, because a lot of them were actually being indicted for, attempted murder or manslaughter. So I had to start going back over and looking at it together with other information. So I'm not going to read you out about any more phrase now.